Good morning, Daniel.
Hey there, Dan.
What is on the agenda for today?
We have a good conversation ahead of us. First, we're going to talk about people not feeling rich when they are, gifting an inheritance early instead of waiting until later in life, and then passing on values versus things to heirs.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, so we are doing the loaded questions conversation here, or alternatively, you have won the lottery and you're not sure how to feel about it. I'm gonna hope it's the latter for your sake, but I'm guessing it's the former.
I've won the lottery of life, Dan, not the actual Powerball, however.
Oh man, I think we can all say that on some level. Hopefully, maybe not everybody, but we'll all hope to live the lives we want and enjoy and so on. So, Daniel, go ahead and hit me here. What do we want to talk about first?
I want to talk about this phenomenon or thing I've started to observe with folks we speak to or just various people out in the community. And it's this idea of people that are objectively wealthy and quote unquote rich, never really feeling like they are. It seems to be something that comes up more and more often when we show folks their net worth or their cash flow, and they say, "Wow, on a day-to-day basis, it doesn't feel like I have that much money." Uh, why do we seem to hear this from people so frequently?
So there's a sort of moving goalpost problem that happens in wealth and affluence, which is unless you are literally Elon Musk, there's always somebody on earth who is wealthier than you. Always doesn't even if you're Bill Gates, there's somebody wealthier than you. The people who have a comparable amount of wealth. I mean, even just to take my own perspective on this, when I started this practice, a decade ago, I had never literally had more than $5,000 to $8,000 at a time at any point. And so the first time somebody handed me a check for even like $140,000, I was like, oh my God, that's a lot of money. And now today we'll get checks for over $1 million. I'm like, yep, it's Tuesday. So there's just an element of just how much money you deal with and have. But the moving goalpost thing is that fundamentally there's always somebody ahead of you in the financial world. And so it's easy to sort of have this comparison thing, right? I want to live in a bigger house, want to live in a nicer house, I want to have a bigger yard, I want to drive a newer, nicer car. My friend just bought a newer, nicer car than mine, so on and so forth, where the keeping up with the Jones thing kicks in. But also, there's always an example of somebody wealthier than you to see or observe or hear about. And so it always sort of puts you slightly in check, even though your level of wealth might be what anybody else might consider very, very rich or affluent.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. It stems from a lot of social comparison and keeping up with the Joneses, and that impacts how we perceive wealth. So it sounds like it's very relative to the folks you surround yourself with in your community.
That's a really big part of it. There's sort of this pseudo-scientific observation that your personality is the amalgamation of the five people you've spent the most time with. But in the same sense, your cost of living, your lifestyle, all those things can really come into play. I'll use myself as an example. Among my, call it high school friends group, and probably even a good chunk of my college friends group, just in the last couple of years, I've become the most financially successful, probably not by a small margin for a lot of them. And so consequently, you find yourself having these little sort of unintended slights. You sort of are unintentionally that guy in your social group when you're in that position, because you find yourself saying, oh, like, why don't we go out tonight, and then why don't we go from the brewery to a restaurant, and then why don't we go to over to Abbott and Wallace or Long Tucky and have a drink after that, and then what about a fourth place? Like, you are just very casually spending more money on dinners, drinks, etc., whereas that might be one stop, maybe two stops might be the entire budget of one of your lower income friends, on that path. And so if you're a good friend, you're going to help pick up the tab and you're not going to make them feel bad about it, so that you can all enjoy a good time. But on the inverse of that, even if you're affluent, you might find yourself being the least affluent person in your circle. where that keep up with the Joneses thing starts to become a problem where like you're well off, you've got a couple $1 million, you have a nice house, you drive a decent car, etc. But you've got friends who are inviting you to go on, a 6 week yoga cleanse retreat in Bali. It's going to cost $15,000. And you're like, I can literally afford that, but like, ooh, that's a lot. That's a lot to spend all in one time. And I don't know if I can take that much time off. So it's always this relativity thing where it's not just about keeping up, but also the people you surround yourself with can either ground you or make you feel uncomfortable. And there's no right or wrong spectrum there. Your friend group, your social group, your group of peers is going to vary throughout your lifetime in a manner where there probably will be people who are ahead of you financially, people who are behind you financially. And I think the best thing you can do, regardless where you fall on the spectrum, is to just try to stay humble about it.
Would you say maybe a way to combat the social comparison or keeping up with the Joneses is potentially also to maybe define for yourself what rich is?
I think it helps to set a benchmark at some point early in life and to try your best not to let the benchmark move. So, ever since I was a kid, probably ever since you were a kid, the idea of being a millionaire seemed like a crazy thing. Like, oh man, to be a millionaire, like that's got to be wild. You have so much money, you can do whatever you want. I'm a millionaire and I don't think or feel that way. And I consciously acknowledge that in the process of building wealth and so on and so forth, that even though I could technically cash out all of my investments, portfolios, sell the practice, do all sorts of stuff like that, and probably do a fire retirement, and just go ahead and just live on the proceeds of that, or that I could probably stop saving as much as I do and start taking a lot more trips and spending a lot more. I'm conscientious of the fact that having $1 million even just a couple of years ago seemed like a crazy thing to me, and by extension from that, on the other side of that in my life experience, that even though I've reached that level and that I am objectively pretty well off, that I need to be conscientious of that and just say what happens beyond this point is sort of icing on the cake. I have what I need. What I'm doing now is more about advancing the welfare of my community, of my team, of my family, and so on, beyond the bare necessities of that, what I used to think of as the threshold of wealthy.
Thanks, Dan. That's great. I think going back to the defining what rich is, I was reading a post recently by Mark Sashini who said essentially, most people from the ultra wealthy to those that have to work their day jobs to simply retire, we all really want the same things. It's safety and security for my family. It's the ability to have a place that you can call home, maybe travel once in a while or occasionally, a fulfilling career, nice things, and the option to call it quits one day and maybe not have to work full time. And I think for a lot of folks, we all really want the same things. And once we remove the number from that and ask ourselves, what we want out of life, I think a lot of us will find that we actually are pretty rich.
Well, and I think we get outside of the financial dimensions. A question I used to ask in planning conversations, and I've kind of gotten away from it. It was fun, but it just doesn't feel the same as it used to. But a question I used to ask was, would you rather have, let's say, $10 million, or would you rather have the lifestyle to which you desired? Right? No, not enough to do anything you can possibly imagine, but enough to live the way you would like to. And the way I asked that previously, prior to that framing the question, I used to just sort of look at my potential client and say, "Are you a dragon?" And they would say, "No, I'm not a dragon." And I'd say, "Well, good, because I don't know anybody who wants to sleep on a pile of gold. We just want to use money to accomplish things." And that's sort of the thinking here. There is a money script called Money Focus, in which essentially you use money as sort of a way of keeping score in life. And it's fine to care about how much money you have or how much wealth you have, but it is important to be cognizant that money has no intrinsic value. It really doesn't. It's only worth what we can exchange it for. So, in that particular sense, when you quote unquote have it all, whatever that means to you, a nice house, a family you love, a job you enjoy, a community that you enjoy participating in and feel supported by, at that point, more money is not necessarily going to improve any element of your quality of life. It might help you buy nicer shoes or get your car washed more frequently or something like that, but it's not going to make a material difference in your quality of life the same way it would if you had not reached a level of comfort.
I wish you would still ask some version of that questions in meetings. One of the things that I've heard you say a few times is, we work with almost 180, give or take, households at this point, and we have never once heard somebody say, "My main financial objective is to die with 7 to 8 figures in the bank."
Yeah, and it's just a different version of it. But the dragon thing just became sort of either people would laugh or people would be like, "What?" And the awkward factor of the what is just enough to not want to deal with. But if I have somebody come in and they're wearing like a World of Warcraft shirt, we're going back to the dragon.
I'll wait on it. So
It'll
I think
happen someday.
I think that leads fairly nicely into the second part of the conversation here, which is the decision between gifting to your family when you can afford it during your lifetime versus maybe waiting until you're a little bit older or simply having it be an inheritance for the next generation or for whoever you want to give that to. And it's a pretty interesting conversation because, you can make the argument for both sides. If you give wealth while you're still alive to loved ones, you can see the impact it has on their lives and potentially, make a greater impact. But it seems, at least from my experience, that that's less than the norm. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the value of making that gift versus making people wait on it. Um, First and foremost, I'll just talk to my own parents here for a second. I'm about to say some stuff. I'm fine. I don't need anything. So please don't think I'm talking to you. Um, when we think about the ability to leave behind a legacy, whether that is presently or in the future, it's an interesting conversation. And before you even think about something big like, when I die, what am I leaving behind? I hear an interesting version of this in the education conversation. And it's not to say there's a right or wrong answer, but quite often in the education conversation, I will not infrequently hear a parent or an adult say something like, oh, my kids are on their own for college. Like I had to pay for my college, they're on their own. And that's fascinating to me because there's sort of this old expression that people use, which is, our goal in life is to make the world better than it was for us, for our kids. And so the idea that you're going to sort of generationally pass on hardship intentionally when you don't have to, right? It's one thing if you never had a high income, don't have a lot of money, and you can't afford to help your kids. It's a different thing to have more money than you will ever need and say, I would like to make my kids deal with hardship. There's a really challenging balance parents do have to strike, and generation upon generation has to strike between spoiling their children, which we've all met a spoiled person and been like, wow, I don't know how you will ever function when your parents die. And vice versa, the conversation of, hey, it's okay to help your kids with something and give them a little step ahead in life if you have the means to, because they're going to be better off, getting that home down payment or having their wedding paid for or having their college paid for than they're going to be when they are in their mid 50s and you pass away and they're already almost to the point where they were financially independent on their own. So there's just this balance where I do think it behooves parents and grandparents and so on to really conscientiously think about how much do I need, right? What is necessary for me to die with zero or a little bit more than zero? And how much of an impact can I make on the world while I'm still here? I think it's a really valuable question of insight for people to consider.
It's an interesting question, and I want to play the devil's advocate here and actually advocate for the other side, which is not giving the next generation wealth while you're still alive. Can you try to make an argument for the flip side? Because it seems to be more popular.
I mean, I can make it really easy. Fuck you, got mine. No. The argument often just does tend to come around to a I don't want to ruin my kids perspective. It's this, hey, I knew somebody, I've seen somebody, I've been around somebody whose parents bought them a new car when they were 16 and whose parents paid for their whole college and then paid for them to go to college again because their first degree was just wasted. And then they bought them a house and then they bought them a car when they were born and they paid for their kids' college and they gave them a company, a job at mom and dad's company as an executive when they were 25 and they've never worked hard a day in their life and they're just such a bad person, yada, yada, yada. There's absolutely a line to be drawn around what is spoiling your children or setting them up to lack self-sufficiency and what is actually going to help them get ahead. I can think of one particular example where A couple does work in their parents' company. And on one hand, I'm sure they work really, really hard. And on the other hand, this couple spends everything they make. Because there's always this, sort of looming shadow of mom and dad willing to write them a check for anything. And so, in that context, that works just fine today while the business is super profitable. But that becomes more and more and more of a problem as time goes on because at some point, the bank of mom and dad will retire or close down. And then you're left with what's in it. And if you're not able to replicate their financial success for yourself by inheriting the business or taking over the business, then they have deprived you of the critical thinking skills about how to handle your own finances.
Okay. So let's say you decide to, you listen to this conversation and say, wow, I'd like to give more to my heirs while I'm still alive. How do you navigate potential, conflicts or resentment that may arise if you give early gifts in, say, unequal amounts to inheritors?
Ooh, this is a really fun topic because this really is just a question of equality versus equity. Equality, very, very straightforward, right? I have four children, they all get a quarter, wham, bam, done. And whether one of them was a neurosurgeon multimillionaire and one of them works at 7-Eleven as a cashier, irrelevant. There's a lot of family dynamics that come into this. And the thing I always caution clients with when they say, like, oh, our kids will definitely just like, they love each other and they'll split up things and it'll be easy. My caution there is always no, they will not. They might, but you should assume that they won't and should make it very, very clear how things are going to happen when you pass away. And when you get into the dynamic of gifting while you're still alive versus just how we divvy up things that are left, that is where equity tends to play a much bigger role in the conversation. And equity is sort of an antonym of fair, in some people's view, where the person who is disadvantaged by the equitable distribution because they worked harder, they went to a better college, they have a better job, they married a wealthier spouse, whatever the thing is that puts them at a disadvantage in the equitable conversation. It is what it is. Your family gets to make decisions about what to do with their assets, and any sense of entitlement there is your problem to bear. But in the dimension then of, for example, I'll give an example from my own life of during life gifting. I know somebody whose parents sent them to culinary school and made them live at home when they went to culinary school. And when they graduated culinary school, then, essentially turned them into their personal chef in the household. And in the meantime, they sent their sister to a 4-year undergrad school, paid for them to be in a sorority, let them live on campus, never made them come home, never made them have a job in school. And after graduation, let them move home and gave them no responsibilities, and then let them move off into the world on their own and never once asked anything of them. And so that's something where even though both of them were differently supported by their parents, there was no equity in that, nor was there equality, right? One went to one type of school, one went to a very different type of school, one was asked to do a lot of stuff, one was never asked for anything. And that is where the equity conversation becomes problematic. But if it's a dimension where you have two children and one is a lawyer and one is a grocer, at Safeway, in that type of scenario, to the lawyer, much love to your success and accomplishments. But if your parents want to give the grocer $20,000 to help them buy a small condo to live in, suck it up. You have better opportunities, you have better means. On the other end of that, if you are complaining that your parents are giving your grocer brother, 20 grand every single year and they never give you anything, well, I mean, you can tell your parents how you feel about it, but it is their decision to make. What I would then say to the parents in that scenario is, hey, just because one is wildly more successful than the other doesn't mean that you're not hurting the family dynamic by showing such favoritism, even if it is more equitable in your eyes.
All in all, it just seems like a pretty difficult decision families have to make. So it reminds me once again of more money, more problems.
Well, more money, more problems. And a lot of this really boils down to what career people go into. Like, that's the thing that really stands out in this type of conversation. Because you could have, let's say, three kids, and one goes off and becomes a doctor, one goes off and becomes a lawyer, one goes off and becomes a school teacher. And the equitability conversation is probably going to start leaning pretty quickly in favor of giving the school teacher something rather than the doctor and the lawyer. And primarily, the sole impetus for that is not because any of them didn't do a good job in school, don't work hard in their career field, don't make a good living for what they do. It's that one objectively makes substantially less than the others. And so the parents in that situation might feel compelled to help that one out more, and that one, frankly, may need more help than the other two. That's sort of a dimension where I think you have to consider how much of the imbalance can we attribute to poor decisions versus positive decisions, right? There's nothing wrong with being a teacher or a lawyer or a doctor, but our society values those professions very differently. And so the financial outcome of any of them, even if they all put in equal work, equal effort, and are equally good at what they do, is very different. And so that is an element where, favoring one party over the other might make more sense from an equitability standpoint versus the dynamic where, let's say, one's a lawyer, one's a doctor, and one's a meth addict. Okay, well, the decisions here are very poor and very different, and the meth addict certainly might need help to get sober and get clean and have a better quality of life and get back on their feet. But it is more of a consequence of their own decisions, and so equitability may not favor that person in that circumstance, even though their need might be objectively greater.
Yeah, that's tough too because you can almost make the argument I'm going to give to my heirs based on who needs it the most, but you can also, on the flip side, likely make an argument on who is deserving of it the most, regardless of who simply needs it the most. Uh, do you think that should be taken into consideration too? Because, you know, going back to your example, let's say they're not a meth addict and they're just a regular person with, they work at Walmart as a cashier. They might need the money more, but let's say, through a series of their own decisions, they simply just did not achieve, things relative to their other siblings. They might need it more, but you can make the argument they also don't deserve it nearly as much because they haven't put the time into their own respective career. No?
I think when you get into the deserves conversation and in a dynamic like that, it helps to be judicious in the types of gifts you give. So, for example, just saying, like, hey, I'll just buy you a new car or I'll just pay your rent or something like that, super helpful to that person, but it's temporary. Right, you're just offsetting a current expenditure, and what will then either happen is they will either ideally save the difference or invest the difference in their own human capital, right? They'll go back to school, let's say. So maybe you're supplementing their income so they can go to school and work a little bit. But in a scenario where you just say, like, hey, here's some money and I'm going to pay your rent or I'm going to pay you off your car or something like that, you're helping them out. But often what then happens is that they just absorb the money they would have spent on those things otherwise into their lifestyle. Right. So we've all heard of that example where somebody seems to be kind of broke and their parents give them money and then suddenly they're taking a trip to Mexico and you're like, huh, that doesn't seem like a really good use of that money. But, who am I to judge? I think as parents look at somebody who maybe is not deserving, but who has greater need, I think it helps to attach some strings to that and be very careful with this. Don't put crazy person requirements on your children when you do something like this, by saying, like, hey, I will help you go back to school, or I'll help you finish your degree, or I will help you get a down payment on that house you've been living in so that your rent stops going up. I will help you with those things if you are doing something positive and productive with it. What I'm not going to do is just hand you 10 grand, because I don't know that anything really significantly positive help there will occur with that. It might improve your quality of life, and if that's your sole objective as a parent, then that's easy. But if your objective is sort of to teach a man to fish versus just giving them the fish, then that's a really important element to consider.
Teaching a man to fish versus giving them a fish. I think that kind of sums up the last topic I wanted to discuss here, which is passing on things versus values. And almost going back to the last topic here, let's say you have three kids, 30 years old, 32, and 34. They've likely all had various life experiences and interpret the world in different ways, and wealth as well. And if you give all those kids, say, $100,000, the chances they all do the exact same thing with it is pretty rare and slim. And I don't want to get into a parenting conversation. However, you can make the argument that how they decide to spend that money was probably influenced by the way they were raised and how you educated them around wealth. And it makes the argument for passing down values instead of wealth, and giving your children the intangibles, and maybe not money necessarily. In your experience, how do values like responsibility, generosity, gratitude, and financial literacy get passed down either in addition to wealth or uh, instead of wealth?
Ooh, so I mean, my succinct answer here is they get passed down poorly. and I'll explain that in some detail here. So let me provide two examples of the poorly conversation, and then we can talk about sort of the impact of values versus things. So the first example would be an understanding of how an almost identical upbringing can produce wildly different results. So let's imagine, let's say, twins who are raised in a low income household. The household is always kind of struggling to make ends meet. Maybe they're in subsidized housing, the power, water, et cetera, have been shut off once or twice in their upbringing. Each of these children who are born essentially at the same time, raised in the same environment with the same parent or parents who have essentially the same experiences, barring their sort of personal out of the home, experiences with their friends and whatnot, are maybe going to develop different money scripts. And those two scripts might have very different manifestations. One might come up with money worship, and one might come up with a money avoidance. And one might come up with a money focus. So three different versions of the same experience, producing different examples. So the money worship person might say, hey, as soon as I have money, I might as well just spend it on quality of life, because if I don't spend it, it's just going to go away. Somebody in the money avoidance category might say, I've never had money, and when I have money, I feel guilty about it, because even though I'm providing for myself, I know somebody out there could use it even more than I can. So I'm going to give it away. I'm going to be overly generous with my money. I'm not going to save, because saving just feels weird to me. Or somebody might come up with that money focus thing. Hey, or money vigilance, right? I'm going to focus on accumulating wealth, or I'm going to never spend money. I'm going to be very miserly and penny pincher oriented, because I've never had money, and if I spend money, it'll go away. So same upbringing, but completely different interpretations between these two hypothetical siblings. And so when I say that values are passed down poorly, I think the issue that often arises there is that most of us, through what is called the theory of family financial socialization, where we learn our money habits and beliefs from interactions with our family members and our peers, in that context, a lot of families are imparting lessons they don't intend to. Right, so there's a keen difference between like sitting your kids down and being like, a penny saved is a penny earned, and you got to pay yourself first, and you save 10% of every paycheck, and if you save up for X, then I'll match you. Like, all those deliberate lessons are great, but also you constantly are teaching your children and your family members financial lessons through your behavior, right? When you go to the store with your toddler, and your toddler reaches out for a toy in the toy aisle, and you're in a hurry, so you just sort of pull them by the hand and say, no, we can't afford that, or we're not buying that today. You're teaching them something there about money, right? In your mind, you're just like, I'm in a hurry, let's go, kid. But you are teaching them something about money, and the more times those types of lessons are repeated inadvertently, the more you are teaching your children about money. So not only can you maybe not be financially literate, and therefore pass on bad financial lessons to your family or to your kids intentionally and unintentionally, but you're doing it deliberately. And alternatively, you might be teaching them great deliberate lessons and be teaching them very bad lessons as a consequence of how you're raising them. So that's one very long example of the two examples I have in mind.
There's another example?
There is another example. So, and you were actually here for the other example. So we had our team retreat in New Orleans a couple weeks ago, back in December, and we had a dinner. We invited another financial planner, Jude Boudreau, who's from New Orleans, to join us, and we also had some guests at the table. And at one point, there was a conversation about essentially how much impact we as financial planners have, how much we can do directly to help somebody. And the example that Jude brought up is a person is on a beach and they see a starfish that's, kind of just stuck up on the sand. And so they pick them up and they throw the starfish back into the ocean. And then somebody comes along and says, there's millions of miles of beach, and, across the millions of miles of beach, there's got to be thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of sea creatures that are stranded. And so, you threw them back into the ocean, but what good does it do in the grand scheme of things? And the person said, well, it may not have mattered in the grand scheme of things, but it mattered to that particular creature. And that sparked a response from one of our guests, Dr. Taylor Sharp, who sort of tortured the analogy, but it was easy to follow, which was, okay, well, if you are standing on the banks of a river and you see somebody, drowning in the river, and you jump in to save them, that's good. But if you then keep seeing more and more people coming down the river drowning, at some point it behooves you to go upriver and say, Why are they drowning? What is causing so many people to fall into the river? And that got off on a bit of a tangent in that conversation. But in the context of this conversation, the upstream thing here is often a lack of financial literacy, a lack of values and skills being passed down, and an emphasis on materiality. It's not to say that being material is intrinsically bad, but it is to say that sometimes we sort of focus on things and outcomes rather than the skills we might impart to our family members or the values we might impart to our family members. So to bring it all the way back to your original question, in terms of generosity, kindness, responsibility, so on and so forth, a lot of families are inadvertently, whether despite their best intentions, teaching their children the wrong lessons and then throwing them in that proverbial river. And so there is an element where, as individuals, as families, as a unit trying to pass on better values and skills, it behooves us to really critically look at what we are deliberately imparting and to be conscientious of our children and our family members' behaviors after we think the lessons are imparted to see if we inadvertently have taught them something different than we intended.
Okay, so I'm gonna take a walk up the river for a moment here. So now that I'm here and we've recognized the issue, are there any real world examples of families who have successfully passed down values and wealth in a sustainable way? And if so, what can we learn from them? And if you don't have an example, maybe what are some of those values and ways to start passing that down through our behaviors and maybe through our teachings as well?
Value. I don't really have any examples that I could share because I can think of like clients, but then I don't really want to talk about clients in this particular medium. They have a right to confidentiality. I think in terms of just the values, the things to impart, there really is, I think, ultimately an element, and there's a good book on this, The Seven Stages of Money Maturity by George Kinder. It's a little hippy dippy, but it is good at sort of establishing a framework. The most valuable lesson you can really try to impart through a sequence of experiences and other lessons is that money is important, but it's not the most important thing. What money provides is more important than money itself, and that you personally, regardless of your circumstances, are going to always be responsible for the outcomes. Maybe sometimes life is super nice to you. You are born to a really wealthy family, and money is just never going to be a good problem, or not going to be a big problem for you. Good for you. But most people don't have that luxury. In fact, more people have the inverse problem, which is that they grow up with no money and no support. But at the end of the day, if you spend your life thinking of yourself as a victim, as somebody who has no control over money in your life, then you are doomed to remain a victim in that context, because unless luck happens to strike in your favor, you win the lottery or something, if you never take responsibility for money's role in your life and how your decisions affect money's role in your life, then you will never control it, and consequently you will just be sort of tossed in the storm.
Yeah, I think it can be summarized in nobody's coming to save you.
Yeah, no one is coming to save you, and free money seldom is. And so, in that particular context, as you said right at the beginning of this particular section, we really did sum it up. Teaching a man to fish versus giving them a fish. We are all responsible for the financial outcomes in our lives. There are a million examples of unfair things or imbalanced things or things that shouldn't be a certain way. Right? Teachers should get paid more. Healthcare shouldn't bankrupt people. People shouldn't be going into crazy amounts of debt to get their degree. Shouldn't. Should. There's so many examples of should, but that is not how the world functions. And despite the absence of magic wands, I don't think that there's any way you could realistically make it function in such a way. So in that context, what's important is that you take responsibility not only for your personal finances, but also the finances of your family members, insofar as you're responsible for teaching them the skills to be responsible for their own finances, and then do your best to help along the way where needed.
Easy enough.
Well, that was a fun esoteric conversation, Daniel. So, as always, I will turn it back on you. What have you learned in the past couple of weeks that you think is valuable for our audience to learn from?
Okay, so for those that don't know, beginning in January of this year, I was put back in a planning role. So I'm now once back in a position where I am leading and having conversations with families about important things financially. And it's very rewarding and exciting to be back in this position. However, I'm starting to realize that some of these skills are perishable, given that I haven't used them in my time here for about 8 months or so. And one of the things I'm starting to realize is a lot of the skills that make you very good at becoming a great planner are active listening, empathy, patience, understanding. And I was driving home from work the other day, and I thought this was a cool little tidbit about financial planning. And it's the fact that all of those skills that make you a better financial planning are also just skills that make you a better human being. So the better financial planner I become, I in turn also simply become a better human being. And in the flip side, the better a human being I become, in theory, the better a financial planner I'll become as well. And I think that's a pretty cool thing that's unique to this industry.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.